Hello and welcome to another episode of Casual Learning. I'm your host, John Bannan. What's the deal with the brain versus the soul? This is our matchup for today. Brain versus the soul. Well, the brain is that very complicated organ that sits inside your skull, and the higher thought processes are located in the prefrontal cortex, where there's millions of neurons. In fact, human beings have 3 times as many neurons in our cortex than an elephant. So there's good reason to suspect that consciousness is a result of this incredible multitude of neurons that human beings have in their frontal cortex relative to all other animals. We have the most, the highest concentration, the most neurons in our cortex. There's very good reason to believe that consciousness is created by the brain. And human beings are unlike any other animal in that we have triple the number of neurons in our cortex than even an elephant. So that's a pretty good explanation as to why humans are conscious, and it's because of our brains, our brain matter. However, there are others who would argue that the higher brain functions, especially abstract thought, is given to us by a soul. And the argument is that it can't be the brain, so it has to be the soul. The brain's not capable of doing that, so it has to be the soul. So, who's right, right? Well, the brain is the most complicated organ known in the universe, and the human brain in particular. And the human brain just happens to be located in the very spot where consciousness resides. So it seems like there's a pretty clear correlation between the brain and consciousness. And therefore, one could pretty clearly state that, and be right, that the brain creates consciousness. It frankly seems obvious. I mean, it would have to be an enormous coincidence that the most complicated organ in the universe also happens to be in the exact spot where consciousness is located, and yet not be the cause of that. So, but there are people who will argue that it's not the brain responsible for certain higher abstract thought, it's the soul. And why would they say that? Why would they say the soul is the cause of this? Well, their reason is this. They say the brain is not capable of certain abstract thoughts, and no material process is capable of certain abstract thoughts. And therefore, it has to be an immaterial process that allows for abstract thought. This is basically a process of elimination. If you've eliminated all material processes that could possibly allow for this abstract thought, well, then what does that leave? What's left? Well, what's left is the soul, right? An immaterial process. So that's why some will claim it's the soul. Now, their argument for this is really about higher abstract thought and the claim that that's not possible with the human brain or material processes. And they'll say something along the lines of, well, a brain pattern is really just a series of things that have no real meaning in and of themselves unless there is an intellect observing that to understand what it means. So, for instance, you can use as an analogy a series of letters, right? A series of letters. Series of letters. Now, these are just scribblings on a board. Um, do they have any inherent meaning in and of themselves? No, not unless you understand the symbolism of this and understand what these letters, the sounds these letters make, and what those sounds and what those words are, and what those words mean in terms of symbolism. So, understanding what these squiggling lines mean requires an intellect to be able to figure that out. The letters themselves have no inherent meaning. They're just squiggles. They only mean something to a brain or to something that's capable of abstract thought. So these are just letters. Aquinas, Iswrong. They're just letters, just squiggly lines. But you take those squiggly lines, you turn them into letters, you turn those letters into sounds, then the next thing you know it says Aquinas was wrong. And now a person who has a brain, who can understand higher abstract thought, can understand what this actually means. So the idea is any particular brain pattern is really just a bunch of, squiggles going back and forth in the brain. It doesn't mean anything. It in of itself doesn't mean anything, and it can't mean anything in objective material reality. It just doesn't have any meaning. So how can brain patterns create meaning? How could a brain, which is just a material process, it's just a bunch of patterns like this, come to understand what these patterns mean? How is that possible? And that's the basic rationale for the soul. Is you need something to be able to interpret these squiggly lines, and material processes can't do that themselves, and therefore you have to appeal to an immaterial soul to explain how this is interpreted into an idea, for instance. So that's the rationale for the soul. Now, the rationale for the soul presumes that the brain is not capable of understanding these squiggly lines or interpreting them, giving them symbolic meaning. So it's an assumption. I believe that assumption is false. I believe the brain is capable of understanding through a derivative reality that the brain creates, which is a property of matter, what the meaning of squiggly lines are, or the meaning of particular patterns are. And I already did a video basically on this about what's the deal with consciousness, and I did a video on the soul, I believe, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing. But it seems to me that it is quite possible that the brain can, in fact, have a derivative reality that includes things like ideas and mathematics and colors and tastes and sounds. And it is capable of understanding what these squiggly lines actually mean, creating ideas. The brain can create derivative realities, and the derivative reality includes ideas. And all higher abstract thought are ideas. They're ideas. So it seems to me that you can explain where abstract how abstract thoughts are possible in reference to brain circuitry and relays and electrochemical structures within the brain. I think it is complicated enough that it's able to do that. It's a property of matter, and it is a mystery. You know, if I asked you, well, what is the color orange anyway? You couldn't answer me because there's nothing in objective outside reality that is the color orange. Color orange is a derivative reality only seen inside a human brain or the brain of an animal that has color vision. But outside that, it doesn't exist. It's a derivative reality of the brain. But the brain is capable of doing that. It's a bit of a mystery, surely, but it's also a property of matter within a brain. And to our knowledge, only a brain is capable of creating these sorts of derivative realities. But that kind of mystery of, well, how does the brain create the color orange, I think is a much simpler mystery to solve than the mystery presented by the soul and how the soul interprets these things. Now, and I'll explain to you why that is. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas tells us that the soul is a subsistent it's a simple subsistent form. Soul is a simple subsistent form. Now, what does that mean? Well, what this means is that the soul is not made of parts. It's simple, not made of parts. Rather, it's a form. And it is its own thing. But it's also a created subsistent form. It's created. And that's a key to this brain versus soul issue. It's created. So, what is St. Thomas Aquinas claiming? He's claiming that a created soul, which is not made of parts, is nonetheless capable of letting us understand abstract thoughts. It's called intellection. In other words, it gives us the intellectual capacity to understand universal principles. So, you could see that, I don't know, that's a bottle. But we could also understand the idea of a bottle, the abstract notion of what a bottle is. So, Aquinas is saying that there is this immaterial, created thing that's not made of parts that tells us about the concept of a bottle. Now, the big problem with this is saying something is created and then also saying it's not made of parts. Because those two things are contradictory. Um, you know, everything that changes in itself has moving parts. So when you claim the soul doesn't have moving parts, but it's also created, it's a created thing, then what you're really describing is an indivisible unit of matter. I mean, if the thing isn't made of parts, then how does it can't be divided? It can't be made into smaller things. Well, in physics, we usually call this an indivisible unit of matter. And indivisible units of matter, let's just say, for example, a photon, a particle of light, they really can't do an awful lot besides, move and pop into existence or out of existence. Perhaps they have some properties of particles as well, like maybe mass, or inertia, angular momentum, that sort of stuff. But they're certainly not capable of anything as complicated as what the soul is capable of, allegedly. Intellection and abstraction and abstract thought. So this is a big problem. This is a big problem to claim that something that's really got the definition of an indivisible unit of matter is possible. Things so complicated that even the most complicated organ in the known universe is incapable of it. But that's what Aquinas is claiming. He's claiming that. And the only reason he's claiming it is because he doesn't see how the brain could do that, could understand intellectual abstractions. He doesn't think material processes are capable of doing that. And he's wrong. He's wrong. They are. The brain is complicated enough. And it's in the right spot, and it is capable of intellectual abstraction. So in the brain versus the soul debate, the brain wins. Now, the idea of a created simple soul raises another big problem. When you claim that there's a created thing like the soul, and that it's not made of parts, then you say it's capable of intellection and understanding abstractions and abstract thought, then you're saying this thing is capable of making decisions. I mean, you have to be able to decide whether something fits within a certain abstract category in order to understand abstracts. So, I look at this and it's like, well, you ask me, is this a bottle? Well, I got to decide before I can say, yes, it's a bottle, or no, it's not a bottle, in the sense of what the abstract concept of a bottle means. So, the idea that a simple soul, not made of parts, a created thing that is capable of making decisions, and highly abstract decisions at that, abstract decisions that supposedly the brain is not even capable of, means that, where does this decision making occur? How does it occur? How does something that doesn't have parts decide something? How does it do that? The answer is it can't. What created thing without parts can decide anything? A created thing without parts is an indivisible unit of matter, a photon. Photon can't figure out that this is a bottle. So how can a created simple soul without parts understand high abstract concepts? It's impossible. It can't. It's not possible. So if you claim, like Aquinas does, that it can think of abstract thoughts, well, then where does this come from? Where's the soul's ability to come, to do this come from? Because it obviously can't come from its parts, because it doesn't have any. So the only other place it can come from is nowhere. Nowhere. So it's got to be decision-making from nothing. Absolutely nothing. That's the problem with the soul. It's a huge problem. This particular soul. So you got a soul that is engaging in decision-making with no parts, which leaves as the only possibility that it gets this from nothing. What else is there that can do it besides its parts? Remember, this is a created soul. Created. Created, meaning it was caused. We're not talking about an uncaused God here. We're talking about a caused soul. This is a created thing. There was a time it didn't exist. It's a created object, or a thing, an immaterial thing, but it's created. So, how does it understand abstract thought? It's got no moving parts. The brain has got an enormous number of moving parts, and supposedly it still is incapable of understanding abstract thoughts? Well, how does something that doesn't have any parts at all, that's a created thing, understand these abstractions that the brain can't? Well, it must come from nothing. There's nothing else that can do it. So, right away, you see there's a problem with this. You can't, nothing comes from nothing. Ex nihilo nihil fit. So this is impossible. This is impossibility. So again, the brain wins. As between two alternatives, one being the brain and the mystery of how it creates derivative reality such that it could have ideas like abstract thoughts and intellection, versus the idea of a created simple subsistent form which doesn't appear to have any means whatsoever of doing what it's supposedly capable of doing, which is the greater mystery to solve. It's the soul, because you're never going to solve that because it's impossible. So why would you ever go this route? It seems pretty clear to me that, the idea, the easier idea, the simpler idea is the brain is responsible for abstract thought and ideas. With the soul, you start talking about a created thing with no parts that nonetheless can do something as complicated as abstract thought. Wow, and then it comes from nothing? Nothing? Well, if you're going to go down that route and believe that you can get such abstract thoughts from nothing with no parts, then what do you need a God for? You need a God in order to decide what to make real and what not to make real out of the infinite possibilities for creation. God is a decision maker. God is uncaused. That's why God doesn't have parts. God's a mystery, but he's an uncaused, necessary mystery. We're talking about a caused mystery here, without parts. But the only way you can do it is from nothing. So, if you can create something that can do something as complicated as understanding abstract thoughts, and it gets that from nothing, well, then why do you need a God? It would be simpler just to explain the whole universe based on this idea that you could get such complication from absolutely nothing, right? Which is an easier explanation. God created the universe, or nothing created the universe. If you're conceding that nothing is capable of such highly abstract decision making, well, then it becomes clear that nothing is an easier explanation. God would be eliminated as superfluous under Occam's razor. Occam's razor says that the simplest solution is the most likely one. That the more assumptions you have to make, the more unlikely the explanation. So if you can assume that the universe can come from the decision making capable by nothing, well, that's clearly a simpler solution than saying the universe has to come into existence because there's an uncaused God who is necessary to make these decisions. So Occam's razor would eliminate God. If you believe this, if you believe you can get this sort of abstract intellection from nothing. So it seems to me that this whole idea of a simple subsistent soul ultimately leads to the conclusion of something from nothing. And if that were true, then Occam's razor would knock God out, and if you get something from nothing, you get the universe from nothing, and there's no reason to believe in God. So, this idea of a simple subsistent form, the soul, responsible for higher intellection, is a really bad idea. It's got to be one of the worst philosophical ideas in Christianity. It's got to be. Thank you, Thomas Aquinas. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas was clearly a genius. There's no doubt about it. But, every once in a while, you can find flaws in his logic and reasoning. And what I just explained to you is probably the biggest flaw I've ever found in any of Thomas Aquinas' reasoning. And it's a doozy of a flaw. Now, why bother with this idea of the soul when there's a completely plausible alternate explanation? It's not necessary that you believe this particular simple subsistent form of a soul. That concept itself leads to, frankly, disproving God. So, and the truth is, the brain is what's responsible for abstract thinking. So what's the alternative solution? Well, the brain is a gigantic complex of neurons and circuits and different parts of the brain do different things. But it's all material. It's essentially electrochemical structures and moving electrons. It's all material. But God can simply transfer that structure upon death into another reality with its own laws of physics, recreating that very structure so that when you die, your consciousness is preserved in a different reality, just as if you were alive here. And that preserved consciousness can later be reunited with a resurrected body. God has the power to create other realities. No one's gonna say God doesn't have the power to do what I just said. He does have the power. God is omnipotent. He's all powerful. If there's a power, he's got it. Can God do what I just said? Absolutely. So why not go with the theory that we know God is capable of doing? He has the power to do it. And it doesn't give you this notion of a simple subsistent form, which makes no sense at all. It makes far more sense to say that the brain is transferred upon death into a different reality where it's preserved. And the thing is, with a different reality, God creates a different reality. It's obviously not a reality that we see here in our reality. It would have to be an invisible reality, but a reality nonetheless. It's sort of like another universe or a multiverse, but a different reality with its own laws of physics. That's entirely possible. God can do that. So, in comparing one reality to another reality, size is relative. Size is relative. So, theoretically, God could transfer your brain structure, preserve your consciousness, your brain, in another reality. And because size is relative, God could make that consciousness, that preserved consciousness and brain structure, as small as he wants to make it. Because size is relative. So it could be as big as just a point. With your own reality, with its own laws of physics and its own, exomatter, God could do that. That could be your brain in another reality. Truly, God is capable of doing that. Since size is relative, he creates smaller particles, different laws of physics. He can do that. He can create that. You couldn't do that in our reality because the brain needs a certain size. But in a different reality, you could, where everything's scaled down in size compared to our reality. Sure, you could do that. So, is there much difference between this and, a soul, which is also just a point? All right. How many angels can you fit on the head of a pin? Right. This is old cliche about debating immaterial beings. Right? Well, if the consciousness of an angel is just a tiny point, and you could fit 1,000,000 angels on the head of a pin, you could do the same thing with human souls, human consciousness. In another reality, they can be tiny things, tiny as a soul. So the truth is, this alternate explanation is really not a whole lot different than the current explanation and the current understanding of the soul. It's just that I've jettisoned this idea of a created, simple, subsistent form with good reason. And then there's an alternative. It doesn't make any real change in our understanding of Christianity at all. But it just makes logical sense. God can create another universe, can create another reality, can transfer our consciousness to that other reality. And of course, the brain would also be made of parts in that other reality. That other reality has parts to it. In another video, I called this exomatter. But it would have parts to it. Just like the brain has parts, because it's essentially the same thing as the brain, or at least the structure is the same. So it's got the same parts in it, or at least a representation of the same parts, so that it responds the same, or the consciousness is preserved. But it is made of parts, so it doesn't violate the the truth that everything that changes in itself must be made of moving parts, and that includes the brain. You can change your mind with your brain, and you can change your understanding of abstractions. So you got to have moving parts. So in an alternate reality where God preserves your consciousness would also be made of moving parts. But he can make them as tiny as he wants, because size is relative. Okay. So in summary, the debate between brain versus soul, brain wins. Brain wins. And what I'm suggesting here is new. It's logical. It's rational. And I'm simply trying to present an alternative to St. Thomas Aquinas' idea of a simple subsistent soul, which I think has major flaws that can't be fixed. And it's true that the Roman Catholic Church does adopt the teachings of Aquinas on the soul. But Jesus never said anything about whether Aquinas' understanding of the soul was correct. Jesus was not a philosopher. So that's one of those areas where the church can change it someday if they want to. When they, once it becomes very, very clear to everybody that consciousness and abstract thought actually does derive from the brain matter, and is a property of the brain. I think the church is going to have to change their philosophy of the soul to accommodate that truth. And I'm just giving you one way that can happen, one alternative way of thinking about how to preserve the brain and consciousness after death and make it immortal. Because that is, after all, what Jesus promises, eternal life after death. So, some people, I suppose, can be really put off by this particular teaching by Aquinas on the soul, because it really is something from nothing, and it's very magical. And Christianity is not about magic. In fact, Pope Francis himself said that God doesn't have a magic wand. So the Pope understands that you just can't appeal to magic to explain things like Aquinas does in this simple subsistent form he calls the soul. It's really magical. And I don't find it worthy of belief. And I think there's a better alternative that makes a heck of a lot more sense. So I just thought I'd share that with you, just in case you find that the church teaching or Christian teaching about this soul idea, this subsistent form idea, really catches you off guard and makes you wonder why anybody would think that that is correct. So that's sort of an explanation. And this Aquinan idea of the soul is not necessary to believe in Christianity. I mean, Jesus never said that Thomas Aquinas was correct about his philosophy of the soul. It's not necessary, but it can become a stumbling block, I would think, for some people, and very confusing. So I wanted to explain what the problem with it is, and how I understand the confusion, and there's an alternative way of thinking about it. Perhaps not the only alternative way of thinking about it, but one way that I came up with. All right. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. If you like what you heard, please press the like button. And I hope this helps you, especially those who have to come to grips with this understanding of the soul taught by the church, and to understand the issues with it, and that you're right to be skeptical of the whole concept, and don't get discouraged. Someday, hopefully, the church will correct this philosophy of the soul and give us something that makes a heck of a lot more sense and is consistent with modern science and the brain and what they're finding out about the brain. But this stuff takes time. This topic was very esoteric and abstract and complicated, and my guess is many of you who are watching this probably don't understand a lot of it. Someday, maybe, if you learn a lot more about these philosophical topics and the teachings of Aquinas, you may get a better grasp of what I'm saying. But trust me, there's reasoning and logic behind everything I just said. And it does make sense, even though you may still be scratching your head. But I thought it was worth trying to explain some of this to you guys. All right. Take care, everybody.